Europe in the early 1300s was bustling, with booming populations, new towns and grand cathedrals rising. But beneath the surface, the land was overworked, forests cleared, and the environment strained to its limits. Most people were peasants, tied to the land, living hard lives under a rigid social order. The feudal system offered stability, but little hope for change. This apparent golden age was built on a fragile foundation, with too many mouths to feed and resources stretched thin. Few realized how close their world was to the edge. In 1315, relentless rain brought the great famine. Crops failed, prices soared, and millions starved. Desperation led people to eat seed-grain animals, even bark and clay. Disease followed hunger, killing the weak and malnourished. The famine shattered Europe's confidence, exposing how dependent society was on good harvests. Even after the weather improved, the scars remained a reduced population, a slumping economy, and a shaken faith. The church struggled to explain the suffering, and pessimism spread. This disaster was only a prelude to something far worse. By the 1340s, Europe's trade routes brought wealth and hidden dangers. Ships from Genoa and Venice carried exotic goods, but also disease. No one understood germs. Illness was blamed on God or bad air. Far in Central Asia, a deadly bacterium, Yersinia pestis, spread from rodents to humans via fleas. The disease traveled the Silk Road, reaching the Black Sea and the city of Caffa. There, a Mongol siege turned deadly as plague broke out, and infected corpses were hurled into the city. Fleeing Genoese merchants unknowingly carried the plague towards Europe. Before the plague arrived, rumors of a devastating pestilence drifted into Europe from the east. Tales spoke of entire cities wiped out, but most Europeans dismissed them as exaggerations. The threat felt distant, almost mythical, and daily life continued as usual. Even informed merchants focused on trade, not distant disasters. No one imagined the pestilence could cross continents and seas to reach them. But the invisible enemy was already on its way, following the very trade routes that brought Europe its riches. In 1346, the Mongols besieged Caffa, a vital Genoese trading post on the Black Sea. Plague ravaged the Mongol army, killing thousands with terrifying speed. In desperation, the Mongols catapulted plague-infected corpses over the city walls. Panic spread as the disease took hold inside Caffa. The city, once a hub of commerce, became a tomb. The Genoese fled by ship, hoping to escape the horror. Unknowingly, they carried the Black Death toward Europe's shores. In 1347, Genoese trading galleys fled Caffa, sailing west across the Black Sea. On board, sailors and merchants carried a deadly passenger, the plague. The ships reached Messina, Sicily, where the horrifying sight of dead and dying sailors caused panic. Rats carrying infected fleas scurried onto the docks, disappearing into the city. The plague spread rapidly, plunging Messina into terror. Residents fled, carrying the disease to surrounding areas. The death ships continued their journey, spreading the plague to Genoa, Venice, and other major ports. From there, the Black Death began its march into the heart of Europe, following trade routes and waterways. The Black Death wasn't a curse, but a bacterium, Yersinia pestis. It lived in black rats and was spread by fleas. In crowded cities and ships, the black rat, an excellent climber, nested in roofs, walls, and ships. Merchant ships and trade caravans carried rats and fleas, spreading the plague from Caffa into Europe. The Black Death had arrived as a secret stowaway. The Black Death spread swiftly from Italy's ports in 1347. Carried by unsuspecting travelers, the disease moved with human speed, using trade routes to reach every corner of Europe. The plague began with black rats carrying infected fleas. In unhygienic towns, fleas bit humans, injecting deadly bacteria into their bloodstream. Buboes, painful swellings appeared, often leading to death within days. Pneumonic plague infecting the lungs spread directly between people, making it incredibly contagious and deadly. From Italy, the plague advanced through Europe. By 1348, it crossed the Alps into France. Florence was hit hard, losing over half its people. Boccaccio described a city in collapse. The disease followed shipping lanes. Ships brought it to Marseille, then Avignon, killing thousands. By June 1348, it reached Paris. That summer, a ship from France docked in Dorset, England. The plague arrived in the British Isles and spread rapidly. By 1351, it was in Russia. Europe's interconnectedness became its vulnerability. Faced with a terrifying disease, the people of the 14th century desperately sought an explanation, often through faith. The plague was seen as divine punishment for the sins of mankind. The leading medical theory centered on miasma, or corrupt air, carried in poisonous vapor. People tried to purify the air, burning aromatic woods and carrying bouquets of flowers. These measures gave people a sense of control. Doctors wore masks with long beaks filled with strong-smelling herbs, while the real enemy, a microscopic bacterium, continued its silent and deadly work. When prayers and bonfires failed to stop the relentless march of the plague, fear and suspicion began to consume society. If God was punishing the world, many reasoned, then surely some people must be more sinful than others. The terror created a desperate need for someone to blame, a human agent who could be held responsible for the catastrophe. In many parts of Europe, especially in France and the German-speaking lands, this search for a scapegoat turned with brutal intensity towards Jewish communities. Hateful rumors began to spread, accusing Jews of deliberately poisoning wells and water supplies. This accusation was baseless and absurd. Jewish communities were suffering from the plague just as much as their Christian neighbors, due to their crowded living quarters in segregated ghettos. But in the climate of mass hysteria, logic and reason vanished. The rumors spread like wildfire, fueled by centuries of religious prejudice and economic resentment. In town after town, mobs rounded up the Jewish population. They were tortured until they confessed to the imaginary crime and were then horrifically executed, most often by being burned alive. Entire communities were wiped out in these pogroms. The authorities reacted in different ways. Pope Clement VI issued papal bulls declaring the Jews innocent and threatening to excommunicate anyone who harmed them. He pointed out that the plague was killing people in lands where no Jews lived. Some rulers tried to protect their Jewish subjects, but in many places local authorities either participated in the violence or were powerless to stop it. The massacres were carried out with chilling ferocity, as terror drove people to commit unspeakable atrocities against their neighbors. Alongside the organized violence, a wave of superstition and folk magic swept across Europe. People turned to amulets, charms, and magical incantations to ward off the disease. They bought potions from quacks and charlatans who promised miracle cures. Some believed that prayers or religious relics would grant them protection. These beliefs existed alongside Orthodox religion, a testament to the complete breakdown of the known world. When science, government, and even the church seemed powerless, people grasped at any hope, no matter how irrational, to survive the all-consuming terror of the Black Death. The terror of the Black Death began as a deeply personal horror. It started with a shiver, a headache, or an ache in the limbs. The initial unease would quickly escalate into a raging fever. Within days, the most dreaded sign would appear, the bubo. A hard, painful swelling would emerge in the groin, an armpit, or on the neck. It was a visible mark of death. Discovering a bubo was a moment of pure terror. Strange black or purple spots would appear all over the body. The victim might begin to vomit blood. In their final hours, they would suffer from extreme neurological symptoms, before succumbing to septic shock and organ failure. For the family watching, the experience was a living nightmare. The swiftness of it all was perhaps the cruelest part. 14th century physicians were tragically unprepared. Their knowledge was based on ancient Greek and Roman texts, which taught that health depended on the balance of 4 bodily fluids, or humors. They believed the plague was caused by an imbalance of these humors, triggered by the corrupt miasma in the air. Attempts at a cure focused on rebalancing the body's humors and purging the poison. One common treatment was bloodletting, draining blood to remove the excess hot humor. Another approach was to directly treat the buboes, believing these contained the concentrated poison. Once soft enough, they would lance it with a knife. Desperate people also turned to potions and herbal remedies. None of these cures had any effect on the Yersinia pestis bacterium. They were simply shots in the dark. As the death toll mounted and no one knew how to stop the disease, a powerful instinct took hold. The instinct to flee. The writer Giovanni Boccaccio noted that the idea that the only defense was to get away became common knowledge. People abandoned the plague-ridden cities, heading for the countryside. The rich retreated to their isolated country villas, hoping to wait out the pestilence. This mass exodus had a devastating effect. As nobles, merchants, lawyers, and officials fled, the structures of civil society began to crumble. They carried the plague with them, introducing it to previously untouched rural villages. It often meant abandoning family members who had fallen ill. The fear of contagion became so powerful that it severed the most fundamental human bonds. As the plague intensified, the normal rituals surrounding death and burial completely collapsed. In ordinary times, a death was a solemn community event, marked by church services, a wake, and a procession to the local churchyard. But the sheer number of victims made these customs impossible to maintain. The priests were either dead themselves or overwhelmed by the endless tide of death. The grave diggers could not keep up. The comforting rituals simply vanished. The dead were everywhere. Bodies were left in houses where they died, abandoned in the streets by those who collapsed while walking. At night, carts would be sent through the cities with the crier shouting, "Bring out your dead." Families would bring the bodies out and place them on the cart. These carts would trundle to the edge of town to massive, hastily dug pits. The bodies were tipped into these plague pits like refuse, layered one on top of the other. These mass graves were a profound source of spiritual distress. For the medieval mind, a proper Christian burial was essential. To be thrown into an unmarked pit with hundreds of others was a horrifying prospect. It felt like abandonment by God himself. The sight and smell of these pits became a constant, gruesome reminder of the catastrophe. It was a visible sign that humanity had lost control. The psychological toll was immense. People lived in constant, gnawing fear. Every cough from a neighbor, every church bell tolling, was a reminder of their own mortality. Normal life was replaced by eerie silence, broken only by weeping and the rumble of death carts. The world became grim and colorless, stripped of hope and comfort. For survivors, the experience left deep trauma, a sense that the world was unstable and dangerous, and that death was always lurking, waiting to strike. The scale of death was unimaginable. The Black Death took the rich, the poor, the young, and the old. It's estimated that between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population perished between 1347 to 1351. This demographic collapse altered the continent. The world was emptier, haunted by the vanished. Cities lost at least half their inhabitants. Entire villages were wiped off the map. The constant ringing of church bells eventually fell silent because there was no one left to ring them. The streets were quiet, replaced by a ghostly silence. The world felt broken, its population hollowed out. Many believed that the end of the world was at hand. The trauma left a deep psychological scar. The familiar world was replaced by an uncertain future in an empty land. The plague's impact on the family unit was catastrophic. The disease moved through households with terrifying speed, often claiming every member within days. Children were especially vulnerable, and the plague created a vast number of orphans. With so many men dead, women were forced to take on new responsibilities, leading to newfound economic independence in a patriarchal society. The emotional toll on families was immeasurable, leading to acts of abandonment and untold stories of bravery. For those who survived, the grief was overwhelming. The plague broke hearts on a continental scale. The impact on towns and cities was transformative. Before the plague, Europe's urban centers were growing rapidly, buzzing with activity but also dangerously overcrowded and unsanitary. These conditions made them perfect incubators for the disease. When the Black Death struck, it swept through the narrow, filthy streets like a firestorm. The heart of civic and economic life was paralyzed. Markets closed, workshops fell silent, and construction on grand projects like cathedrals and town halls came to a grinding halt. The vibrant, bustling cityscapes of the early 14th century were transformed into eerie, half-empty shells of their former selves. In the immediate aftermath, many urban areas were left crippled. With half the population gone, there were not enough people to perform essential jobs. The ranks of skilled artisans, the weavers, blacksmiths, and masons, were decimated. This created a massive labor shortage, which would have profound long-term economic consequences. In the short term, It meant that the basic functions of the town broke down. There were not enough bakers to make bread, not enough guards to patrol the walls, and not enough officials to govern. The intricate web of specialized labor that allowed a medieval town to function was torn apart, and recovery was a slow and painful process. Some towns and villages never recovered at all. These were communities where the mortality rate was so high that they simply ceased to exist. In England alone, it is estimated that over 1,000 villages were abandoned during and after the Black Death. The few survivors, if there were any, moved away to larger, more viable settlements, seeking work and companionship. Over the decades, the deserted villages were slowly reclaimed by the wilderness. Their stone houses crumbled, their churches fell into ruin, and their fields became overgrown pastures. Today, archaeologists can still find the faint outlines of these lost villages, silent monuments to the plague's destructive power. For the towns and cities that did survive, the plague acted as a powerful, if brutal, agent of change. The sudden drop in population meant there was more space for everyone. The worst of the overcrowded, unsanitary slums were often abandoned and eventually cleared away. This led to a period of urban renewal. Cities began to invest in public health projects, paving streets, improving water supplies, and creating more open public squares. The post-plague city was often a cleaner, more spacious and healthier place to live. It was a recovery born from immense tragedy, as cities were rebuilt and reimagined on the ashes of the old world. With society in turmoil and death a constant presence, the formal structures of law and order began to fray, and in some places, collapse entirely. The institutions responsible for maintaining justice were hit just as hard as any other part of the community. Judges, lawyers, guards, and scribes died in great numbers, leaving courts unable to function and law enforcement crippled. With the authorities weakened and distracted, a wave of crime and lawlessness swept through many regions. Desperate and starving people turned to theft simply to survive, while opportunistic criminals took advantage of the chaos for their own gain. The fear and uncertainty drove people to extreme behaviors. Some, believing the end was nigh, gave themselves over to a life of wild abandon. Boccaccio describes how people in Florence broke into the cellars of the dead and dying, drinking heavily and indulging in whatever pleasures they could find, convinced they would be dead tomorrow. This hedonistic despair was one response to the overwhelming sense of doom. All the rules that had governed society seemed meaningless when death could strike anyone at any time. The moral compass of society was spinning wildly, with many losing their way in the darkness. At the other extreme were the flagellants. These were groups of religious zealots who marched from town to town, whipping themselves with leather scourges tipped with iron spikes. They believed that by punishing their own bodies, they could atone for the sins of the world and persuade God to lift the plague. Their processions were dramatic and terrifying spectacles. They would arrive in a town, march to the main square, and perform their ritual of public penance for hours on end, chanting prayers and crying out for God's mercy. While they were initially welcomed by terrified populations, they soon became a disruptive and revolutionary force. The flagellant movement quickly grew beyond the control of the church. Their leaders began to preach against the clergy, claiming they had the power to forgive sins themselves. They attacked priests and looted churches, and their movement became intertwined with the persecution of Jews, whom they often blamed for the plague. They represented a complete rejection of the established religious and social order. Eventually, Pope Clement VI condemned them as heretics in 1349, and secular rulers, fearing their power to incite rebellion, moved to suppress them by force. The flagellants were a powerful symptom of a society pushed to its breaking point, where fear had shattered faith in all traditional authority. The first wave of the Black Death burned itself out by 1351, but the world it left behind was fundamentally and permanently altered. The plague did not simply vanish forever. It would return in smaller, less devastating outbreaks every decade or so, serving as a constant, grim reminder of the Great Catastrophe. These recurring waves made sure that the population just couldn't recover quickly. The immense loss of life was not a single event, but really the beginning of a new demographic reality. Europe became a continent with far fewer people, and this one simple fact would trigger a series of revolutionary changes. The old, crowded and rigid world of the early 14th century was gone for good. The traditional social structure, known as feudalism, had been based on an abundance of labor and a scarcity of land. Lords and nobles held immense power because they controlled the land, and armies of peasants had little choice but to work for them. The Black Death just completely flipped this equation on its head. Suddenly land was plentiful. There were empty farms and abandoned villages everywhere. But labor was incredibly scarce. The peasants who had survived were now a valuable and sought-after commodity. This dramatic shift gave the common people a power they had never known before. The rigid bonds of serfdom began to weaken and dissolve. A serf who was unhappy could now simply run away. He knew that another lord would likely welcome him with open arms, offering better wages and more freedom. Lords were forced to compete for laborers. They offered higher pay, lower rents, and even fixed contracts, turning serfs into tenant farmers who paid in cash rather than labor. The balance of power had started to shift dramatically. This was not a peaceful or easy transition. The old nobility did not give up their power willingly. They saw their wealth slipping away and tried to fight back. Governments passed laws to freeze wages and restrict peasant movement. In England, this was the Statute of Labourers of 1351. These laws were almost impossible to enforce. The economic reality was simply too powerful. The peasants knew their worth and continued to demand better conditions, leading to decades of social unrest, tension, and violent uprisings. The labor shortage profoundly impacted ordinary people. For survivors, the post-plague world offered unprecedented opportunities. Wages soared, and common laborers had disposable income. They could afford better food, clothes, and savings, leading to a golden age for the peasantry. Their living standards improved dramatically. Surviving peasants could now afford to eat meat, cheese, and butter regularly. This prosperity led to social changes and spurred local industries. The nobility, alarmed, tried to maintain old social distinctions. The scarcity of labor also drove innovation and interest in labor-saving devices. The Black Death dealt a blow to the Catholic Church. Its prayers failed to stop the dying, causing many to question the Church's role. A spiritual crisis began to brew. New forms of religious expression emerged. People sought a more direct relationship with God. A grim obsession with death became a central feature. Thinkers began to question papal authority. The spiritual unity of Christendom had been cracked. The Black Death rippled through European life, planting the seeds of the modern world. The old feudal order was weakened. The power of kings and centralized governments grew. A new emphasis was placed on practical experience and observation. Public health became a major concern for city governments. The economic and social changes unleashed by the plague were a crucial catalyst for the end of the Middle Ages, fueling the cultural and intellectual explosion of the Renaissance. The Black Death was a tragedy, yet a new Europe was born, a brutal force that cleared the way for the dawn of a new age. The Black Death is more than a grim chapter from the past. It reshaped human history. The plague killed millions and an entire world. The shift in power between labor and capital, the decline of the aristocracy, and the rise of a common class set the stage for modern economics. It paved the way for the Renaissance and the Reformation. It left a legacy obsessed with death and fate. Understanding the Black Death is essential to understanding the modern world. It demonstrates how societies can be remade by crisis. The tale of the Black Death, especially in the wake of modern pandemics, offers a chilling mirror to our own vulnerabilities. We see how a novel pathogen can travel silently, spreading with terrifying speed across an interconnected world. The reactions of people in the 14th century also feel strikingly familiar. We see the spread of misinformation and the blaming of scapegoats. Furthermore, the Black Death highlights the critical importance of public health and scientific understanding. Ultimately, the Black Death forces us to confront our own relationship with the natural world. It serves as a powerful reminder that human society is deeply embedded within it. The distant horror reminds us that our own health is inextricably linked to the health of the planet. The Black Death was a story of unimaginable horror, but also of human resilience. Survivors adapted, seizing new opportunities. They innovated, creating new systems. Even in the darkest times, ingenuity can forge a path forward. Catastrophic events are powerful agents of transformation. creating space for something new to grow. The Black Death's legacy is a message of hope. It reminds us that humanity can carry on and asks us to believe in our resilience.